Hello there, welcome to my presentation. My name is Trevor McFadden, and today I'm going to be discussing the topic of creativity. So before I get started, I'm going to ask a simple question. Think back to when you were a kid. What was the most creative Bible skit you have seen as a kid? How was it? What was it like? So in this presentation, I'm going to be discussing the topic of creativity, what creativity is, some information behind creativity, and how to implement creativity into children's ministry. So let's first start off with the definition of creativity. According to Merriam-Webster, creativity comes from the root word create, which means to make or to produce or to cause something new to exist. In children's ministry, creativity is key in developing a truly unforgettable experience for children. But at its core, creativity is problem solving, meaning that ministry leaders should not only think about what to do, but also about how to do it. To give some examples about creativity in children's ministry, I'll talk about a couple of these. I'm sure you have some ideas about what other kinds of examples you can come up with, but here are some of my examples. So having an interactive media presentation like PowerPoint to demonstrate a Bible lesson, or having a Bible memorization process, like using Popsicle Sticks to spell out John 3:16. You can definitely use snacks to illustrate biblical point, like you can use Oreos to allude to Jesus' bodily resurrection. But creativity is not just a human concept, it's also biblical too. Even the apostles had to get creative. This story in Acts 6 talks about this problem where the Hellenists were being neglected, the widows were not being fed, and so the apostles had to come up with a solution to basically feed these guys, but also to spread the gospel. Their solution, as you probably know and read from this passage, is to appoint 7 men, which will be the deacons, the servants, and they go and serve. This is an example of creativity in ministry, but this whole principle can be implemented into children's ministry as well. What does creativity mean to you? How can you best implement creative practices in your own ministry? Have you been involved in creatively planning children's ministry ideas? If so, how was that experience? So now I'm going to talk a bit about some information regarding creativity. So a lot of this is from a logical point, a logical perspective. And so a large part of being creative in children's ministry includes being able to understand or observe the most current teaching methods being used today to teach children today. Now, over the last 4 years, the methods of teaching and learning with children in the church have significantly changed from a content-focused approach that relied heavily on direct instruction and to a process or journey experience that is more collaborative and nurturing in terms of the child's faith formation. That quote is from Larson, and in a report that was done during 2020, there was a significant change during the last 4 years from there being content-driven approach to children's ministry to there being a experience-focused approach. And there's 4 learning models that another study has done, and they broke down how children learn. And so there's 4 different learning models within children's ministry. There's the contemplative, reflective, instructional analytic, the media-driven, and pragmatic participatory. I'll break these down real quick. So, contemplative reflective uses feelings and contemplation and experience to really dwell in the presence of God. Instructional analytic model uses mental activities and memorization and biblical instruction to teach children how to store the Bible in their hearts. So automatically you would assume Awanas, and that would be correct. Awanas is a good example of instructional analytic model being implemented into place. The media-driven active engagement model uses videos or other forms of media to get children emotionally and spiritually engaged with the material. So for example, you can use the Connect HQ videos or Bible Project videos. You can find those on YouTube or online. And those are videos which engage the children not just to learn about biblical ideas and truth, but to also engage them in asking questions that maybe are a little emotional or spiritual. Finally, there's the pragmatic participatory model, which uses games and activities to promote and learn key biblical points. One example might be to use the game Simon Says to promote obedience to God, or to maybe have kids walk around with blindfolds to represent the toughness of faith. So here's the little praxis, and as you can see, there's the 4 quadrants where each model fits in. What model works for you? In children's ministry, there is a whole spectrum of how children are, because there's not only the culture of the children's ministry itself, but also the culture of the church. If your church is more on the feeling and contemplative end, then obviously something more experience-driven and contemplative might work. But if your church is high energy, then obviously something more along the lines of media-driven, active engagement might work for you. How can these models aid in the creative process? Remember, these are tools, these little presets, they're important to use, but these are not the end. These are just the means. And so these tools can help you in learning and growing as a children's ministry and children's ministry leader. Finally, we're going to talk about implementation. How can we best put this into practice? So being creative in children's ministry first requires asking, how can we do this? How can we pull this off? During 2020, a lot of churches were being forced to shut down. And so to think outside the box, local churches and parachurch organizations had to get creative. They had to think outside the box, especially when it came to children's ministry. This quote by Holmes demonstrates the efforts in the UK to pull that off. So here's a scenario. So let's come up with a scenario here. So May is a 30-year-old, who was recently onboarded by her church to be the children's pastor or director in the children's ministry. May is a recent graduate of Talbot and wants to start her career as a children's pastor director at her church after receiving the curriculum for the children's ministry and getting the right people to volunteer. May needs to start planning some of the creative aspects of ministry. What are some of the events or crafts she should plan? Well, May could use one of the 4 models in her teaching and planning. She can use snacks as illustration tools. She could think of new games and crafts. She can look for new worship videos. She can use dress-up or other interactive elements to further the impact of Bible story. And there's plenty other things that she could use. But in children's ministry, you want to become creative. You want to implement the creative practices in your own ministry. So what would you do in that situation? If you're a May, how would you respond? What would you do? Are there things you would add? I think for me, I wouldn't add anything, but I'm sure you guys could probably come up with other things to add as well. So just to recap, we first talked about definition, definition of creativity. We talked about some information regarding creativity. And finally, we ended with some implementation of creativity and a practical real-life scenario which you can implement the practices of creativity. Here's where I got my information from. Just in case you're wondering where you pulled that from, well, I did some searching and I found some excellent resources. Most of my resources I found on Christian Education Journal. And so if you're wondering what resource you can best use for children's ministry, I would highly recommend CEJ. I would like to end this time with the closing question. Think back again to when you were a kid. What was the most creative Bible skit you have seen as a kid? How would you make it even more creative? That's all I have to say. Thank you very much. God bless.